Hi everyone. I think it's a good time to start. I'd like to welcome everybody to this final event of our Green Street program, where we have Dr. Josiah Rector speaking and our guest discussant Sarika Chandra for a topic on environmental justice. We had Green Street program full of activities, and I hope you participated and enjoyed. And I'm happy to have our major speaker here and our guest discussing today with us to talk about environmental justice and environmental justice in Detroit. Dr. Josiah Rector is an assistant professor of history at the University of Houston. He received his PhD in history from our own Wayne State University in 2017. And today he will be talking to us about his forthcoming book, which is titled Toxic Debt and Environmental Justice History of Detroit, which will be coming out early next year. And we also have with us guest discussant Dr. Sarika Chandra, Associated Professor of English, also here at Wayne State University, who does research in areas of race and capitalism, as well as environmental and food politics, globalization studies, and other related areas. So the plan for today is Josiah will be speaking for about 30 to 40 minutes. We'll then have Dr. Chandra come on and discuss some of the topics of the conversation. At this point, you will be asked to add questions to the chat, and then we'll have about 30 minutes at the end, 20 to 30 minutes at the end to address any questions people have. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Josiah Rector to our talk. So thanks so much. Go ahead.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, so y'all can hear me, right? Good. So my talk today is based on my forthcoming book, Toxic Debt, Environmental Justice History of Detroit. And I'm going to be focusing in particular on the themes of race, austerity, and the remaking of the environmental justice movement in the city. Okay, so I want to start with two alarming statistics. So it is estimated, according to reporting in Bridge magazine, based on FOIA records from the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, that the city of Detroit shut off water for over 250,000 people between 2014 and 2019. There's 141,000 residential accounts. Almost certainly over 250,000 people have had their water shut off in this period. Moreover, it's estimated that the rate of child lead poisoning in the city of Detroit actually increased between 2012 and 2016 from 6.9% to 8.8%. And as you all know, this coincides with the so-called Flint water crisis, the catastrophic mismanagement by a series of state-appointed emergency managers of the switch of the city of Flint from the Detroit water system to the Flint River, and the resultant increase in lead poisoning, but also exposure to copper and waterborne bacteria. And yet the city of Detroit actually had a rate of child lead poisoning over twice as high as Flint in 2016, which is not as well known. Okay, so on one level, we might say that this is not particularly surprising. Anyone who is familiar with the environmental justice movement and the interdisciplinary field of research that it has inspired over the past 30 years will hardly find it surprising that low-income communities and communities of color are disproportionately exposed to environmental health hazards. This is not news. Detroit, of course, is a city that is 78.3% African-American. According to the US Census count for 2019, the percentage of the population living under the federal poverty line is estimated at 35%, although that's probably an undercount. We would expect to see disproportionate environmental hazard exposure. However, as I show in my book, it's impossible to explain fully, at least, the water crisis in Detroit and Flint and phenomena like increasing child lead poisoning simply through the dominant analytical frameworks of environmental justice studies, which tend to focus on fence line communities, that is, communities that are living adjacent to or in close physical proximity with toxic waste dumps, oil refineries, incinerators, and other pollution sources. These studies are helpful, and they explain some phenomena, like the fact that the 48217 zip code in Detroit is the most polluted in the state of Michigan. And in many ways, 48217 is a prototypical frontline community. So these kinds of studies do explain some of the environmental inequalities that we observe in Southeast Michigan, but they can't explain, for example, why there were no major, or the water shutoff crisis in Detroit had no real parallel in the history of the city since the Great Depression. As I show in my book, there was a water affordability crisis in Detroit in the early 30s, but water shutoffs only occurred intermittently between about 1933, 1935, and 2002. So what explains this recent explosion? And why would child lead poisoning decline in the late 20th century, but then increase in the early 21st? So to explain this, we really need to connect environmental inequality to phenomena such as financial deregulation, municipal debt, welfare reform, privatization, and austerity policies. Now, these are things that scholars of neoliberalism and finance write about in urban studies, sociology, anthropology, and other fields, but they often do so in isolation from the debates occurring in environmental justice studies. So I try to connect race, finance, and environmental injustices, concept of toxic debt. Now, toxic debt is usually used to refer to debt that has been devalued as a financial instrument, but I use it to refer basically to the offloading of environmental costs by financial institutions in the state onto low-income communities and communities of color. And I argue that the dominant causes of environmental injustice in Detroit over the past century are, on the one hand, efforts by white segregationists to exclude African Americans from desirable neighborhoods and jobs, and on the other, by capitalists in heavy industry, finance, and real estate to externalize environmental costs onto workers and communities. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how those trends have persisted, but also changed over time. Also, in my book, I challenge the so-called origin story of the environmental justice movement, which often dates it to the protests against PCB dumping in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982. Scholars often refer to the Warren County protests in 1982 as the birthplace or the origins of the environmental justice movement. But as I show, activists in Michigan, including some from the city of Detroit, were using the concept of environmental justice over 5 years before the Warren County protests. And I am going to talk a little bit about how the concept of environmental justice changed between the mid-70s and the mid-80s, and I'm going to relate it to the restructuring of Detroit's political economy in the context of both deindustrialization and the rise of austerity politics. Okay, so I argue in my book that, that both racism and capitalism historically have required spatial arrangements of environmental inequality. Someone could turn their mic off. I'm hearing some distortion in the background. But these patterns have changed over time. So I use the concept of an environmental inequality regime, which I define as a spatial order of unequal environmental hazard exposure along the lines of race, class, gender, embedded in the urban political economy. And in particular, I divide the history of Detroit into three sort of environmental inequality regimes or spatial orders of environmental inequality. The first corresponds to a period that we might call liberal industrial capitalism, which also includes the first phase of Fordism between the 1880s and the 1920s. The second is so-called regulated Fordist capitalism, which political historians sometimes call the New Deal order between the 1930s and the 1970s, and then neoliberal post-Fordist capitalism between the 1980s and the present. At the heart of my book is an argument about the relationship between environmental inequality and the so-called New Deal order. I argue on the one hand that African Americans benefited less than whites from the New Deal order, including things like financial regulations, the welfare state, and the unionization of manufacturing, but also public infrastructure investments in both economic and environmental terms. And they did so because of housing and job discrimination. So that is relatively well known, especially if you've read books like Tom Segura's The Origins of the Urban Crisis. But I make another corollary argument about the New Deal, which is that African Americans also suffered more from the dismantling of the New Deal order than whites, both in economic and environmental terms. And I really show how neoliberal policies and the dismantling of the New Deal regulatory state, welfare state, and unionized manufacturing jobs since the 1980s has been devastating for working class and poor people across racial lines, but especially African Americans. And I show how these policies have contributed directly to the water disasters in both Detroit and Flint. Okay, so I'm going to focus relatively little attention on the first part of my narrative because it's outside the scope of today's talk, but I'm just going to make a couple brief points about environmental inequality before the Great Depression in Detroit. Between the Great Fire of 1805 and the Panic of 1893, over the course of the 19th century, Detroit gradually expands from what had been a small fortified colonial trading post where European and Euro-American settlers enslaved indigenous people and people of African descent to a rapidly growing industrial city with a predominantly foreign-born working class. And in the so-called Gilded Age and the early 20th century, environmental inequalities in Detroit result from two interlocking factors. So on the one hand, the local business elite opposed anything resembling environmental regulations, unsurprisingly. So there was a real push against, for example, the passage of a municipal smoke ordinance for decades in Detroit. And there was also a lot of resistance to raising the city's bond debt limit to finance the build out of infrastructure. The state of Michigan imposed stringent bond debt limits on the city, and this made it very difficult to build a sewage treatment plant prior to the policies of the New Deal and the incoming of federal aid and grants for infrastructure. So infrastructure was very spotty, and immigrants, especially on the east side, and African Americans were concentrated in neighborhoods with the worst sanitary conditions. Now, I argue that in the late 19th, early 20th century, the most salient racial and ethnic divide in terms of environmental inequality in the city was not between Black and white Detroiters in an undifferentiated sense. It was really between native-born white Detroiters on the one hand and immigrant and African-American Detroiters on the other hand. So African-Americans and foreign-born and first-generation immigrants, especially on the east side, lived in comparable conditions with respect to access to sanitary infrastructure and air quality and workplace safety. On the other hand, Detroit had a relatively small African-American population before World War I, under 5%, according to most counts. Now, this changes in World War I in the 1920s with the first great migration of African-Americans to the urban north. So the African-American population of Detroit goes from just over 5,000 people in 1910 to over 120,000 people in 1930. And African-Americans coming from the South to the North seeking opportunity, especially jobs in the automobile industry, are faced with, of course, racial discrimination in both the housing market and in the labor market. In the housing market, this means the Detroit Real Estate Board supporting restrictive covenants. It also means white mob violence and groups like the KKK and other purveyors of racial terrorism. But the upshot of housing discrimination is that African Americans have fewer opportunities in the real estate market and have to live in relatively overcrowded neighborhoods. And this contributes to a rapid increase in tuberculosis amongst African Americans in the 1920s. Tuberculosis rates actually fall for whites in the 20s, but rise for African Americans. That's connected to housing discrimination. At the same time, African Americans in the automobile industry find themselves consigned disproportionately to jobs that cause occupational diseases, to the most dangerous jobs, especially in foundries and paint shops. So for example, the Ford Motor Company assigned 46% of all Black workers to foundries between 1918 and 1947, in comparison with only 5% of white workers. And this means that Black men in the auto industry in particular are much likelier than white men to have shorter life expectancies from occupational disease, although many white men also suffer from those problems as well, to be sure. And in the case of women, African-American women get some employment during World War I and wartime production, as do white women. But the patterns of gender segregation in the industry generally mean that the most dangerous jobs go to men, especially Black men, and to a lesser extent, immigrant men. Okay, so the second part of the book focuses on the so-called New Deal order. And I make a kind of a two-sided argument about the New Deal, which I alluded to earlier. So to understand this, of course, we have to go back to the crisis of the Great Depression. So in 1929, with the stock market crash, the Ford Motor Company lays off around 75,000 workers. The city's relief rolls increase 50 times over. And there's this crisis by 1930-31 of mass unemployment in the city, increasing hunger, homelessness, evictions, home foreclosures. There's also a water affordability crisis, which is not well known in the Hoover years in Detroit. Actually, as Detroiters lose their jobs and as poverty and unemployment increase, many Detroiters are unable to pay their water bills, or they stop paying their rent, and then their landlords stop paying their water bills in response to that. So there's actually over 100,000 water bill delinquencies in Detroit in the first 2 years of the Great Depression. So the New Deal responds to this and comparable crises in both urban and rural America in communities across the nation. And it does so in ways that most of you are probably familiar with. We can characterize this in a broad sense as a shift from liberal to regulated Fordist capitalism. So part of the New Deal involves emergency loans and banking reforms. So, for example, Detroit is able to restructure its municipal debt with Wall Street banks because of the Banking Act of 1933. That actually saves the city from bankruptcy. Detroit is able to restructure its municipal debt and pay lower interest rates. And this makes it possible for the city to slow the layoffs of workers and cutbacks in city services. Nearly 100,000 Detroiters are put to work by the WPA, rebuilding the city's water and sewer infrastructure, including the water and sewer system. Detroit opens its first sewage treatment plant in 1940 because of WPA and Public Works Administration funds, for example. And this is a boon to public health. It helps reduce the rate of typhoid and other waterborne diseases. The rate of tuberculosis goes down in Detroit, both for Black and white Detroiters, actually faster for Black Detroiters than for whites, in large part because of the Social Security Act and various public health programs associated with the WPA. Also, the unionization of the automobile industry and other industries, which are eventually occur under the auspices of the National Labor Relations Act, give more working class Detroiters access to health care because of the union benefits. So the New Deal does improve overall public health. On the other hand, the New Deal reinforces environmental inequality because of racism in housing and labor markets. So in the case of the housing market, as most of you probably also know, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, in its residential security map in 1939, much as it does in the rest of the country, redlines almost all neighborhoods with African Americans, but also a substantial portion of neighborhoods with foreign-born immigrant residents. So over 90% of neighborhoods with African American residents get redlined by the HOLC, and the FHA incentivizes the use of restrictive covenants in Detroit. So by the end of World War II, 90% of new housing developments in the city and its suburbs are closed to African Americans because of restrictive covenants. So they redline African American neighborhoods. They tighten the problem of restrictive covenants until the Shelley v. Kramer decision in 1948. And ultimately, New Deal housing policies contribute to environmental inequality because, on the one hand, they make it easier for whites to leave the inner city and to relocate to areas with better air quality and newer housing stock in outlying parts of Detroit, and especially after World War II, the suburbs. As late as 1968, you have over a dozen suburbs of Detroit that have zero African-American homeowners. That's because of redlining, and before that, restrictive covenants. And so whites get privileged access to areas of better environmental quality because of racist housing policies. Also, redlining starves inner city communities of capital for home repairs and building maintenance, and this contributes to the problem of lead poisoning. And so you have this whole belt of housing, especially south of of 6 Mile or McNichols Road, which by the 60s and 70s is basically falling apart. And redlining contributed to that. And public health experts would call this Detroit's lead belt. And the problem with child lead poisoning is directly related to the dilapidation of structures, which is exacerbated by redlining. Finally, I should note that New Deal labor policies under compulsion from a militant industrial labor movement do give workers the right to strike and create a framework for collective bargaining. On the other hand, they do very little, if anything, to upend the patterns of job discrimination that existed in the factory prior to unionization. And we could debate about whether union seniority policies make the problem worse, but there's no question that African Americans remain disproportionately concentrated in more dangerous, lower paid, semi-skilled and unskilled occupations, especially in foundries and paint shops, well into the post-war era. And this will ultimately cause the founding of the Trade Union Leadership Council in 1957, pushing for Black representation in UAW leadership, as well as opening the skilled trades to African Americans. And then in a more militant form, the revolt of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement in 1968. And we can see this as a kind of response ultimately to the failure of unionization and certainly the leadership of the UAW to take on job discrimination, racism in manufacturing, at least enough to fundamentally change these entrenched patterns. Okay, now it's also pretty well known what happens after World War II with regard to deindustrialization and white flight. So I'm not going to take too long on this, but I do want to connect it to environmental inequality. So all of you know, I'm sure, that Detroit lost 335,000 manufacturing jobs between 1950 and 1983. This will continue for decades after. So I believe in 1950, Detroit has 349,000 manufacturing jobs. It has 23,000 manufacturing jobs by 2007. So the city's industrial base is dismantled and closed down in wave after wave of plant closure between basically the Korean War and the early 2000s. And it's continued even more recently. And that had obvious consequences for the city's tax base, as well as the problem of structural unemployment. At the same time, you have white flight caused in large part by these racist housing policies that I mentioned before. So Detroit loses over 1 million white residents between 1950 and 1980. And many of them move to single family homes in the Detroit suburbs, but also to other regions. In the 1960s alone, over 400,000 whites leave the city. This coincides with the second great migration of African Americans to the urban north, on an even larger scale than the era of World War I in the 1920s, beginning in World War II, and then continuing, as you can see on the graph there, through the 50s, 60s, and even into the 1970s. And the consequence of that is massive demographic reversal, where African Americans, go essentially trade places with whites in terms of demographic representation of Detroit's population. Now, this contributes, in addition to deindustrialization, to the contraction of the city's tax base. So property tax revenues in Detroit fall by 75% between 1950 and 1990. So the city's African-American mayors, including Coleman Young, elected in 74, and his successors like Dennis Archer, Kwame Kilpatrick, Dave Bing, they inherit this chronic set of structural problems generated by deindustrialization and white flight. This also contributes to environmental inequalities. On the one hand, you have this increase in toxic brownfield sites generated by abandoned factories. On the other hand, you have the problem of redlining. So by 1967, African Americans comprise 40% of Detroit's population, but over 82% of the residents of substandard housing. And if you look at the environmental activism in Detroit, both in the city and the suburbs in the 1960s, it reflects these intersecting problems, right? So the United Auto Workers plays an interesting role in post-war environmental politics. So the United Auto Workers, under the leadership of Walter Reuther between 1946-47 and his death in a plane crash in 1970, does support the environmental regulations of Presidents Johnson and Nixon. including what will become the Clean Air Act amendments of 1970. Reuther dies before the passage of the Clean Water Act, dies the same year that Nixon signs OSHA. But Reuther basically supported the expansion of the regulatory state at the federal level. Indeed, he argued that we needed federal air and water quality standards because state level standards were too variable and that incentivized capital flight. The UAW also sponsored organizations like the Downriver Anti-Pollution League, which was founded in 1969, and it represented members of conservation committees and UAW locals in the downriver suburbs where you had some of the worst pollution. I should point out that although racial segregation and white flight meant that whites had greater access than African Americans to areas of better environmental quality, the suburbs were not all created equal, right? So working class whites lived oftentimes in relatively polluted suburbs, especially in the downriver area, which had some of the worst air and water quality in the region, unlike middle class and wealthy whites in places like Royal Oak, Grosse Pointe, to say nothing of the automobile executives living in Bloomfield Hills. So there was an attempt by the UAW to sort of organize locals in these polluted areas to push the Michigan Air Pollution Control Commission, for example, to enforce air quality laws. There was a support for OSHA. Meanwhile, in the inner city, in places like Dodge, Maine, you have growing discontent with Black workers with the domination of the skilled trades by white men and persisting patterns of racism and discrimination in the plants and the general speed up imposed by the auto manufacturers, especially in the late 60s in response to rising West German and Japanese auto company competition and inflation. So you have speed ups, you have an increasing rate of accidents, and you have chronic problems of occupational disease afflicting workers in dusty and dangerous occupations, and Black workers bear the brunt of that. And there's an explicit connection by the leaders of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, like General Baker, and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, formed a year later, which lasted until 1971. There's an explicit connection between patterns of racial discrimination and oppression, capitalism, and environmental equality. So I just want to quote the LRBW program from 1970. They said, Black workers caught in the most oppressive sector of the proletariat find themselves working in the fastest, hardest, and most exhausting jobs with the worst safety conditions and the most hazardous occupations to workers' overall health. They emphasized the sort of litany of toxic substances that factory workers were exposed to. Many workers are subjected to intense toxic fumes from chemicals used in metal plating and processing, they wrote. And sulfuric acid, nitric acid, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, dyes and chemicals causing bladder cancer, ozone from heat welding, dirt and oil in the air are all entering and destroying the bodies and internal organs of healthy workers. They argued that it was the responsibility of the revolutionary workers movement to provide leadership in the struggle and to clearly demonstrate to the masses of workers that to control and improve conditions, to control the process of production, we must control the instruments of production ourselves. Now, I want to try to run through this. I don't want to go into too much detail because I want to leave space for the end of the talk, but that point raised by the LRBW that control over production was related to these patterns, not just of racial discrimination, but also exposure to unsafe conditions, was also recognized by the leaders of the UAW. So for example, both Reuther and Leonard Woodcock were inspired by Swedish social democracy and supported what they called democratic economic planning. But they believed basically that corporations had to be subjected to democratic pressures to force them to clean up pollution and not simply offload costs onto workers and communities. But the UAW is in something of a bind with regard to environmental politics between Reuther's death and the mid-70s. And you see this especially in the OPEC oil embargo of 1973-74 with rising oil prices, lines of gas pumps, and mass layoffs, including hundreds of thousands of UAW members losing their jobs between 1973 and 75, pushing the unemployment rate in Detroit to over 25% by the Ford administration. So UAW leaders were well aware, as were rank and file workers, that workers bore the brunt of pollution and that it contributed to problems like silicosis, occupational cancer, and lead poisoning. At the same time, unlike middle-class professionals, blue-collar workers of all colors could not afford to prioritize closing polluting facilities over the jobs that they provided. So companies took advantage of that vulnerability by explicitly threatening to close factories and move to areas with weaker pollution laws, as well as weaker labor unions or no labor unions, in response to the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and OSHA. So UAW leaders responded by forming coalitions with civil rights groups, environmental groups, and some feminist groups to try to push for full employment policies that would also address environmental, race, and gender concerns. So for example, in May 1976, the UAW sponsored a conference called Working for Environmental and Economic Justice and Jobs, a national action conference at the Walter and May Reuther Education Center in Black Lake, Michigan. And this conference brought together people like Norman Hill from the A. Philip Randolph Institute, who had marched for voting rights at Selma. You had members of activist groups like Hiawatha Davis of the Denver, Colorado Eastside Action Movement, Norman Daniels of the Urban League, William Benbow of the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. There were also Native American activists there, like Gerald Wilkinson of the National Indian Youth Council, representatives of the United Steelworkers of America, Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, and others, the League of Women Voters, and of course, the environmental organizations like the Sierra Club, Audemars Society, Isaac Walton League, and the like. And the main, one of the main arguments that union leaders and many environmental activists made at the conference was that to resolve this tension between jobs and the environment, there needed to be a commitment to full employment at the level of federal policy. And in particular, they advocated for the Humphrey-Hawkins bill, which in its original form would have reduced unemployment to 3% over, I think it was 5 years, through an expansion of public works and employment. And they advocated specifically connecting full employment policies, public works projects, and a massive build out of solar energy, conservation projects, and environmental cleanup programs. Moreover, civil rights and feminist activists at the conference called for incorporating affirmative action and anti-discrimination into such policies so that people of color and women would have equal access alongside white men to these jobs in the emerging renewable energy and recycling industries. So this is a long story, and I'm going to try to make it short. So basically, most of the policies advocated at the Black Lake Conference get defeated in the second half of the 1970s. So for example, the Humphrey-Hawkins bill basically gets hollowed out in Congress because of corporate lobbying. Frankly, it's not unlike what we're seeing right now with the stimulus bill, where many of the most ambitious proposals are pared away because of corporate lobbying pressure. And so what is passed essentially is a toothless bill in 1978. And then in 1979, President Carter, under pressure from Wall Street and corporate executives, appoints Paul Volcker to the Federal Reserve. And basically this is in response to rising rates of inflation, especially during and after the Iranian Revolution and the second oil shock. So Volcker nearly doubles interest rates, provokes a massive recession, which results in 3 million auto and steel workers losing their jobs between 1979 and 1982. And this wave of plant closures is really devastating for the city of Detroit, even more so than what had occurred during the energy crisis. And it really undermines the efforts at coalition building that had occurred at Black Lake. The UAW will back away from many of these environmental coalitions in the 80s because of plant closures and deindustrialization. And moreover, efforts to build a multiracial environmental movement are undermined by the combination of residential segregation between cities and suburbs and the racist politics of the New Right and Ronald Reagan. It's in that context that the concept of environmental justice, which had started to get popularized around the time of the Black Lake Conference, begins to change its meaning. And in 1982, there's a historic protest against PCB dumping in Warren County, North Carolina, where these waste hauling companies illegally dump PCB along roadways in North Carolina. Governor Jim Hunt proposes dumping the PCBs in a majority Black, impoverished county, Warren County. And there's a massive protest movement that links national civil rights groups and activists like Benjamin Chavis with environmental organizations. And Chavis will go on to coin the term environmental racism in 1987 at the time of the release of the Toxic Waste and Race Report. And the movement against toxic waste dumping and environmental racism increasingly becomes synonymous with environmental justice, which is understandable given what had happened in the late 70s. But this earlier attempt to connect the labor movement and sort of an anti-austerity full employment politics with environmentalism, civil rights in the mid-70s was largely forgotten. And I try to recover that story in my book. Okay, so the last section of this talk is going to focus on what I call the politics of toxic debt. And I'm going to use two case studies. Number one is the Detroit Incinerator, and the second is the water crisis in the city of Detroit. And I'm just going to see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, good. All right, so in the 1980s, there's a breakdown in the sort of environmental coalition politics of the 70s, and this occurs along race, class, and gender lines. And I demonstrate this in the case of the campaign by an organization called the Evergreen Alliance against the Detroit Incinerator between 1986 and 1991. The Detroit Incinerator, which closed in 2019, was the largest municipal waste incinerator in the United States and was built in 1989, or opened in 1989 rather. And there was a real pitched battle to stop this from happening. Activists engaged in countless marches, filed lawsuits, but they were unsuccessful. And I argue that they did so in large part because of the breakdown of coalition politics and also the role of the incinerator in Detroit's municipal debt. So the Evergreen Alliance campaign coincided with intensifying polarization between the city and the suburbs along race and class lines, and a kind of an antagonistic metropolitan politics between white suburban leaders and Coleman Young. And basically, in 1990, the US Census Bureau classifies Detroit as the most segregated metro area in the United States. And I show in comparison with other cities that had successful anti-incinerator movements at the same time, like Philadelphia and New York. We could also add LA, actually. Detroit had a more segregated environmental movement. You have a predominantly white environmental coalition in the Evergreen Alliance fighting against a project supported by the city's first African-American mayor and a Black majority on the city council. And the breakdown of multiracial coalition politics made it hard for them to get traction. Moreover, the labor unions largely refused to oppose the incinerator because of the politics of deindustrialization and the sort of jobs versus the environment arguments that took traction in that context. Okay, now who was the ultimate winner from the Detroit Incinerator getting built? So by the 1990s, the Detroit Incinerator was the largest source of Detroit's municipal bond debt. It was financed with municipal bond sales to investment banks, went way over budget, resulted in $1.4 billion in debt. And the city, because of the deficit it was facing in the early 90s, had to sell the incinerator to Philip Morris USA and also General Electric. Philip Morris owned 70% of the incinerator between 1991 and 2008. Why did Philip Morris want to buy the incinerator? Because of a loophole in Reagan's second tax bill, the 1986 Tax Reform Act. Philip Morris got $200 million in tax breaks for owning this polluting facility in a predominantly impoverished African-American neighborhood on the east side at the junction of I-94 and I-75. And the ultimate winners here were the basically investors in Philip Morris and General Electric. So for example, Roger Penske, well-known local billionaire, auto racing magnate, longtime resident of Bloomfield Hills, pictured here receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Trump in October 2019. He actually sat on the board of both Philip Morris and General Electric while they owned the incinerator. So ultimately, the facility was beneficial most to people like Penske, but it was, Coleman Young was dedicated to the project in large part because of its role in the city's bond debt and the fact that he was concerned that the city's bond ratings would be lowered by the ratings agencies if the city failed to sell the incinerator. Okay, and then finally, I want to talk about the water crisis. So there are a couple senses in which debt is central to the recent water crisis in Detroit. The first is financial deregulation and the subprime mortgage meltdown. So In 1999, President Clinton signed the Financial Services Modernization Act, which scrapped Glass-Steagall, the New Deal era firewall between investment commercial banks and insurance companies, which encouraged a wave of mega mergers in Wall Street. You also have the deregulation of swaps and derivatives with the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. And increasingly in the late 90s and early 2000s, the banks were marketing subprime loans, particularly in communities of color. These are often adjustable rate mortgages with a teaser rate of 1%. They later will hike up to 17%. And these are basically toxic mortgages, which were sold in many cases with the direct knowledge that the buyer would default. And Detroit had the highest rate of subprime foreclosures in the United States between 2005 and 2007. Now, the subprime mortgage meltdown and the financial crisis are related to the foreclosure and water crisis in the city in a few ways. So I'm drawing here on the excellent scholarship of the legal scholar Bernadette Atwain, who's shown that between 2011 and 2015, the city of Detroit foreclosed on over 100,000 properties for non-payment of property taxes. And they did so because in direct violation of the Michigan State Constitution, they refused to adjust tax assessments to reflect the crash in property values after 2008. And as a result, homeowners are being massively overcharged for property taxes. Furthermore, water bill debt was added to the tax liens for homes. And there's, for example, as many as 7,000 homes entering tax foreclosure in 2016 in Wayne County were because of water bills being placed on their tax lien. And if you look at the map on the right by We the People of Detroit, it shows the high percentage of tax foreclosed homes in 2014 with water bill debt on their property taxes. Okay, so the increase in water shutoffs is connected to the subprime mortgage meltdown, but it's also connected to predatory lending to the city of Detroit itself, enabled by financial deregulation. So people talk often about the corruption of Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick, which was quite real, but they often isolate it from the broader context of financial deregulation in the 2000s, in the late 90s. So for example, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000, signed by President Clinton in the lame duck period of his presidency, deregulated the swaps market. I'm gonna wrap up in the next 5 minutes. You know, I'm going a little over time here. And the deregulation of interest rate swaps in particular was disastrous for the city of Detroit. Kilpatrick entered a $1.4 billion deal with UBS AG and Merrill Lynch Capital Services in 2005. And this included an interest rate swap to fund the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, DWSD. And basically the interest rate swap was a bet that interest rates would rise rather than fall. But then in 2008, the Fed slashed interest rates practically to zero, ensuring that Detroit lost the bet with the banks. The banks then charged $547 million in swap termination fees to the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. And that led to a massive increase in debt service. So by 2012, 40%, almost half of the revenues that DWSD is getting from water users are going to pay debt service to the Wall Street banks, which have been inflated by the predatory swap deal. So indeed, the DWSD debt played a key role in Detroit's exploding debt in the 2000s, which is pictured in the graph on the right. Another important component was pensions. We don't have time to go into that. So if you look, for example, on the left at this breakdown of Detroit's debt as of 2014, the largest source was DWSD debt, and that is directly related to the predatory swap deal. That's not the only factor, to be sure, but it played a role. As you also all know, or many of you know, in March 2013, Governor Rick Snyder placed Detroit under emergency manager Kevin Orr under Public Act 436. And Orr, among other things, imposed radical privatization, outsourcing, and austerity policies on the city of Detroit, not unlike emergency managers in Flint, Highland Park, and other Black majority communities in Michigan. So, for example, it was under Orr that DWSD imposed its harshest shutoff policy yet. In March 2014, when Detroit is under emergency management, DWSD announced a new policy where someone behind as little as $150 on their water bills could have their water shut off. They also outsourced the shutoffs to a private company, Wrecking. And it's really in the 5 years after emergency management and before the COVID-19 pandemic that you see the highest shutoffs in Detroit history, 141,000 residential accounts. There's nothing comparable to that in the history of Detroit going all the way back to the Great Depression. And it's no coincidence, I would argue, that it happened during and after emergency management and the sort of economic restructuring that it enabled the state to impose. Okay, I want to end with the water rights movement. So working class African-American women in the water rights movement really played a key role in resistance to water shutoffs. And that's no coincidence because the effects of welfare reform and these austerity policies have disproportionately harmed African-American women, particularly poor and working class African-American women. So in 1999, President Clinton signed welfare reform, 1996, President Clinton signed welfare reform, and the number of welfare recipients in Wayne County fell from 107,000 in 92 to just 24,000 in 2000. And that wasn't because of decreased poverty. Poverty was actually increasing, but fewer people are able to get benefits. So the AFDC is abolished and replaced with the more punitive temporary program TANF. Also, welfare reform devolved welfare payments to the states, which then often sought to cut welfare rolls by any means possible. So Michigan's Republican governor, John Engler, for example, in 2002, eliminated the vendor pay program as part of welfare reform. And vendor pay was a program whereby TANF would assist recipients with utility bills to prevent shutoffs. And the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization pointed out in a newsletter in 2003 that this led directly to nearly 30,000 people being at risk of shutoffs. And shutoffs did indeed begin increasing in large part because of welfare reform in the early 2000s. But then it really explodes after the 2008 crash. So I don't have time to go into detail, but the two major phases of the resistance movement against water shutoffs in Detroit are pre and after 2008. And before 2008, it's largely the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, but also groups like the Highland Park Human Rights Coalition fighting against shutoffs in both Detroit and Highland Park. I encourage you all to see Liz Miller's documentary, The Waterfront, in the first phase. And then in 2008, you have the founding of the People's Water Board and the resistance movement that notably leads to the arrest of activists like Marion Kramer and the Homrich Nine. But we could also look at the career of someone like Maureen Taylor, pictured on the right side of the slide. But the People's Water Board is really led by these veteran welfare rights activists, but it includes environmental, labor, and other organizations in the city. So I just want to say one last thing. So there's a direct connection between the social reproduction crisis in these communities and the water crisis. As Maureen Taylor pointed out in a 2003 essay, it was fitting that in the case of Detroit, organizations led by women and the many individual women who joined them were those who stepped up to oppose human rights violations in the city. Marion Kramer pointed out that women carry the heavy burden from water shutoffs. You can't bathe your children, you can't do nothing. And look, my thing is go without water for 3 days and see what can happen, unquote. Okay, so in conclusion, my main argument here concerns the legacy of the New Deal, but also what my analysis might indicate for current debates about the Green New Deal, decarbonization, and the public health crisis in Southeast Michigan. So does Detroit provide lessons for a Green New Deal? So as I argued before, because of housing and job discrimination, African Americans benefited less from the New Deal order than whites, both in economic and environmental terms. On the other hand, they also suffered more from its dismantling in the neoliberal period. And this is how you get a situation like hundreds of thousands of people forced to live without running water in a state surrounded by the Great Lakes. These kinds of absurd outcomes are a product of the sort of toxic legacy of housing and job discrimination, deindustrialization, and neoliberal austerity policies and the way that they affect racialized populations in particular. So how do we get out of this mess? Well, I would argue that to really achieve environmental justice, we have to look beyond the fence line. It's not just about addressing the disproportionate siting of polluting facilities in low-income communities and communities of color. We also have to look at a financial system which is narrowly constrained by the imperative to maximize profits for private investors. we need a revival of public investment. And there is a precedent for that in the original New Deal. But we also know what went wrong with the original New Deal. Now in the context of climate change, we have scientists telling us that we need to decarbonize our economy rapidly to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. We have civil engineers telling us that our infrastructure is failing. It gets a D+ in much of the country, right? So we need to rebuild our infrastructure. We need to decarbonize, and that's not going to get done by a private sector fixated only on short-term profits. We need a revival of public investment, but we also need to learn the lessons of what went wrong with the original New Deal, principally around race, but also gender inequity. So with regard to race, there needs to be a prioritization of frontline communities when we think about where public investment goes, right? The communities that were redlined should really be front in line for public investment. Also, with respect to gender, when we think about public works, we're not just talking about shovel-ready building trades jobs in predominantly male occupations, although those jobs also can and must go to women. But we also need to expand care work in sectors that in which women predominate, including childcare, elder care, healthcare more broadly. And that also needs to be connected to the way that we think about green jobs. So my final message is that to achieve environmental justice, we need to look beyond the fence line. Thank you.
Thank you, Josiah. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I would like to welcome people to put their questions in the chat box. I see a couple of them here, and if you can make them brief, the briefer the better. So please do so, and I'm going to welcome Professor Chandra here to make some comments first, maybe for about 10, 15 minutes or so, and Josiah, also, if you see anything in the chat you would like to address specifically,
Sure.
if you can feel comfortable to do that. So go ahead, Professor Chandra.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Josiah, for your talk, and thank you both for inviting me to participate, and also for the opportunity to preview parts of your book. I look forward to its publication. I very much appreciate Josiah's effort to join the critical writing on political economy with that on the environment and also on the social divisions such as those of race and gender. And as you write, race, class, and gender inequalities and exposure to environmental hazards in Detroit, including microbes, industrial air, water pollutants, toxic lead paint, have risen and fallen in different historical periods as a result of changes in political economy and public policy, right? So the theoretical concept of the heart of the book, which is toxic debt, gestures towards the intertwining of the problems of the toxicity of the environment and that of structural inequalities, generating health, housing crises on multiple levels, enabling a sort of re-narration of the history of Detroit that asks us to understand questions of politics, economics, race, and environment in relationship to each other, right? So, for example, the book makes a case for understanding the more recent water shutoffs in connection to the abstractions in finance and the public-private structuring throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, and how this history takes specific forms in Detroit, right? So, and you understand water shutoffs as mechanisms of dispossession, not simply rooted in the residents' inability to pay for water, but must be understood in how such mechanisms are linked to municipal debts, personal debts, and generate serious impediments in the reproduction of families and other networks of support that people have mobilized for resistance and self-defense over a long period of time, right? So I have several interrelated questions, and you can, I will just ask them and you can answer as you see fit. I really appreciated the talk you gave, and then also the kind of understanding at both the sort of cellular level of what's happening in sort of the neighborhoods of Detroit and connecting it to sort of the broader trends in sort of the sort of world system, so to speak, right? And so I would like to hear how you are drawing upon existing critical work in these areas and also updating and formulating and reformulating it. So for example, say the history of Detroit that often focuses on labor and capital disinvestment, right? And then the flight out of Detroit. They often form a certain kind of declensionist narratives that you try to correct by looking at the history of political organizing in Detroit, right? So how does the history that you're telling, or the story that you're telling, enables us to understand more broadly the mechanisms at work in generating the social divisions that you write about? And you're noting more recent critical works, say in the areas of race and racialization, are very generative in opening new areas of investigation, but often do not take into account questions of the environment, right? And so how does your interrogation say that allow you to re-narrate the history of race and politics in Detroit, offer a reformulation of the conception of environment, right? That you see in sort of works, critical works on environment and also on race. And then there is a history of sort of racial, sort of environmental racism, classic works by people like Robert Bullard, who, how do you draw upon this kind of work and then update it or reformulate it? And then also the history, I appreciate the effort to kind of think about the question of crisis that is not sort of understood in terms of actions of individual or even collective state and non-state actors, right? That it has to be understood in sort of these basic mechanisms that sort of structure the entire social field. Often the history of economic crisis is rooted or tries to understand it in sort of through the idea of the dismantling of the regulationist state, right? Of the regulations and capitalist processes. And I would like to hear how you see that as sort of limited. And some of what you were saying towards the end of your talk here, and if you could expand on that. And then finally, looking at the history of organizing in Detroit, how can we sort of assess that or evaluate that, the kinds of impediments that they find, and also, I mean, and how it has shaped up in terms of the constraints it has on it, both in terms of meeting resistance from outside and also maybe a kind of understanding of the political objectives themselves, right? And it is sort of, in other words, how is the history of Detroit sort of generative for understanding the kind of broader systemic process, right? So that's a lot. I will just stop here, and you can answer as you fit, and maybe I'll have follow-up, right?
Thank you so much, Sarika. That's a really rich set of questions, and I'm sure I'm not going to do justice to everything that you said, but I'll do my best. So first, you asked how my work relates to like declensionist narratives about Detroit and narratives about decline. I also encourage folks to read Alicia Montgomery's book, Greening the Black Urban Regime. She has a great section drawing on her ethnographic research, employing this concept of narratives of the fall to think about the way people in both the city and the suburbs talk about the decline of Detroit. But as an ethnographer, she doesn't try to dig into the longer history that I do as a historian. The biggest pushback that my book makes, I think, against the declensionist narrative is to say, look, Things like water shutoffs.
Excuse me, you're saying declensionist, what's that word?
It's sort of decline, right? A focus on
declining.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So it's, a declensionist narrative meaning a decline narrative. So the biggest way that I push back against the declensionist narrative talking about Detroit is to say, look, sure, it's not surprising that communities of color, low-income communities are disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards. We know this, but it's not like these water shutoffs have been going on a consistent basis for the past century. There were very few water shutoffs in Detroit between 1935 and 2002. Why is that? It wasn't because we didn't have racism or inequality, but in many ways, these are the products of disastrous recent policy decisions rather than some trans-historical pattern of inequality that has existed forever. And I think trans-historical narratives can be dangerous because they can conceal how artificial and recent some of these problems are, right? And we know, again, there was a water affordability problem in the early Great Depression, and it was largely resolved by the New Deal, despite all the New Deal problems. And I think the implication of viewing it that way is that the problem can be solved today too, and it's not necessary, right? So I think that pushing back against declensionism pushes back against fatalism. We can say, look, these are totally preventable problems and they don't need to happen, right? As far as how a broader perspective helps us understand, so I am self-conscious about the issue of scale and the fact that I mostly talk about the city and the inner ring suburbs. I don't, like, there are some scholars like Andrew Needham who would challenge the metropolitan focus of like histories of environmental inequality by saying that we also need to look much further abroad. And, so he shows like how environmental inequality in Phoenix is connected to what was happening in the Navajo Nation, for example. So I could bring in much further, much more far-flung areas by expanding the spatial scale. And obviously there's a global context in which we would have to embed this too, not least because Detroit's across the river from Canada. But I can only do so much in one book, obviously, but I do my best to sort of engage with the broader literature and I do try to show how this history in Detroit has broader relevance, right? So for example, I think there's a lot of work remaining to be done on the relationship between debt and environmental justice in other places. This hasn't been researched very much. So I think that my analysis of Detroit offers a lot of research leads for people in other cities because I think this is a hugely under-researched topic. As to how my work offers a reformulation of concepts of the environment and also race. Yeah, so I think environmental justice studies tend to conceptualize the environment relatively narrowly in terms of the spatial location of hazards on the one hand and amenities on the other. Where are the green spaces in the parks in a given metro area and where are the toxic waste sites? That's a very important set of questions to ask, but they don't often connect it to things like the welfare state or the tax system or banking regulations. And these things are not as easy to locate in space, but and in many ways they're connected to broader systems, right? Like federal government policy. So I think that we do need to think about those kinds of systems when we're talking about even local environmental inequality. So I would encourage people when they think about environmental justice, not just to look at where things are, but also these broader systems in which cities are embedded. And I would say the same thing about race, right? So, racial segregation is being pushed by mob violence by white homeowners. It's being pushed by racist local officials. It's also being pushed by the federal government. It's being pushed by banks in New York. So we need, I think, to think at multiple scales to make sense of race, make sense of the environment on a local level. How do I draw on the work of people like Bullard? So, and I have to say here in Houston, I'm just next door to Bullard's home institution, Texas Southern University. And I have taken great inspiration from Bullard. His book, Dumping in Dixie, is a classic. And if you haven't read it, you need to read it. So I think that Bullard in many ways offers a really brilliant example of that sort of classic study of the fence line community. Although some of his work is also branched out beyond. So he has some really important work on disaster and the aftermath of Katrina. And there's also more recently a lot of work on environmental gentrification. I have a chapter where I talk a lot about gentrification in the book. I wasn't able to get to it in this talk because of lack of time or lack of space. But still, I would argue that the issues that I talked about before, including debt, aren't adequately dealt with in the existing literature. And that's what I mean by saying we need to move beyond the fence line. And even to make sense of what's happening in a place like 48217, a classic fence line community, you need to situate it in these broader processes. we have to broaden our conceptualization of environmental injustice. And one last thing I want to say too is this also leads us to think about different actors. When we think about who is an environmental justice activist, why don't we think about welfare rights activists? Why is saying water is a human right not an environmental justice issue? But often the way the narrative is written, we ignore people like that. So someone like Maureen Taylor isn't included in narratives of environmental justice, but she should be in the case of Detroit. And then you might ask, who are the Maureen Taylors in other cities, right? Who is getting left out of the way that we narrate the history of the movement? So I think moving beyond the fence line, as I suggest, would also lead us to reformulate the history of the movement. And that also, I think, connects, well, so there's two other things I want to get to, and then I'm going to shut up. Sarika asked me what I think about this kind of literature that talks about the dismantling of regulations. I'm obviously drawing on like regime theory and this concepts like Fordism and regulated capitalism. So the short answer is that I think that the regulated capitalism doesn't look all that regulated from an environmental perspective. There are almost no restrictions on pollution or worker safety prior to the 70s in the United States. And so the New Deal order doesn't have much in the way of environmental regulation until the very end, just as it's being dismantled. So I think that that doesn't mean that I don't think the concept of regulated capitalism isn't useful. I use it too, because I think it matters that the financial system was transformed by New Deal banking regulations. I think it matters that the UAW had over 1 million members by the 70s. I think it matters that AFDC existed. But I also think that an environmental perspective can highlight some of the limits of Fordism, and then it can also deepen the way we think about neoliberalism, right? Because I think we're leaving a lot out when we talk about neoliberalism in terms of just financial crisis, right? We also need to think about water and air and connect it to this broader set of environmental questions. And then finally, on the issue of organizing, well, I think bringing in social reproduction and bringing in actors like Maureen Taylor, I think also raises different questions about who are history's actors, because the original New Deal was made possible primarily because of a militant industrial working class movement, but also the revolt of farmers in rural areas. And obviously in the aftermath of deindustrialization, we're not going to see the kind of wave of sit-down strikes in the same way, at least, that we did in the 30s. And the working class militancy in Detroit in 2021 is not going to look like it did in 1933 or 1937. But that doesn't mean that we don't have I don't like I live in Detroit, so I won't say we, but it doesn't mean that there aren't active social movements. There's a hell of a lot of organizing going on in Detroit, obviously, and it's not always led by people, by unionized industrial workers, and they matter. And I don't at all want to downplay the importance of that. And actually, I think something like Marion Kramer, I think, really unites the two sides of the coin, right? Because she was married for decades to General Baker, founder of Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, but she also spent decades fighting water shutoffs in Highland Park in Detroit. So she unites in many ways these social reproduction struggles and demands for water for poor family and fighting for water rights for poor working class women with the struggles of the auto workers. And actually, I believe she has family. She has some kids who are in Local 600 who are UAW activists. So in many of the activists families that I write about in the book, you can't really neatly separate these issues, right? Like industrial unionism and struggles for social reproduction and welfare rights and water rights are inextricably connected. But I do think we need to broaden who history's actors are and who is going to achieve social change if we're going to get the history right, and if we're going to improve on the original New Deal and actually achieve environmental justice. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Just for the sake of time, thanks so much for that. For the sake of time, I would like to bring up some questions from the audience here. And I see some people have had to go, but please put a question on the chat if you have any questions. I'm sure there are many relevant related questions to be asked here. So Jessica put some questions here. Maybe I'll try to combine them both. And I think this has to do, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Jessica, but this has to do with the responsibility of government actors themselves. So assuming that individuals, they have integrity and are good people, how were the business elite acting unethically at that time? Did they have the opportunity to act ethically, and how did they fail in this regard? And I think the other one is kind of related, so I'll just put them two together, which brings up the government, right? So because you focus on capitalism, but the government individuals, the policymakers seem to be involved in this sort of shenanigans. So how do you see, I guess, these relationships and the issues of government actors themselves?
Yeah.
And then also, I guess, the role of the individual business owners. Is it capitalism, or is it just individual people?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why I talk about, I try to sort of embed it in political economy is I'm always thinking about the relationship between the political power and the market, right? Because I think you can never talk about capitalism in any historical period without talking about the state and political power. And in the context of Detroit, I think there are multiple very powerful mechanisms whereby business elites influence the government. Obviously, like I think they're, they control the flow of investment that cities need for tax revenues and for jobs for the residents. They control access to municipal credit, and they also, contribute to politicians and lobby and so on. So, whose fault was the water crisis? Was it the fault of the governor? Was it the fault of Kevin Orr? Was it the fault of Dave Bing or later Mike Duggan? Was it the fault of the Wall Street banks pushing the predatory loans and the interest rate swaps? And we could say it's all of the above and that it's impossible to separate them. I mean, but when I talk about capitalism, I'm not just exonerating private government officials. I mean, in many ways, I think the two are handmaidens and inextricably connected. And that also has implications for policy, right? Because I don't think these problems can be solved just by the private sector alone. On the other hand, I don't fantasize that, the private sector isn't going to play a major role. I actually explicitly argue in my book on the one hand that, yeah, we need an expansion of public investment. And I do make an argument in favor of programs like a jobs guarantee connected to green investment. But even within the private sector, for example, you have groups like, people like Ali Dairol, who started a worker-owned cooperative, Writer Cooperative Industries. And you have people who are proponents of worker cooperatives, consumers cooperatives, including like Malik Yakini and some of the folks at D-Town Farm. So even within the private sector, I think there's a range of different ways firms can be organized. So I think we have to talk about revival of public investment. We have to talk about the regulatory state, and we have to talk about different sorts of business models, and we have to talk about labor unions. So there's no simple answer, and there isn't a single set of actors that I think can solve these problems because they're too complex and interrelated. I hope that answers the question.
Was there anything else, Jessica, you wanted to add?
Yeah. Okay, so obviously there's no simple solution, but what do you think are the three most important things that should be focused on? Because there has to be some sort of way that some are more important than others.
Yeah, so well, I foreground the idea of toxic debt because I think that Detroit had the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history, in the past decade, but it also had this water crisis, and I think this clearly shows that we need to, address some of the problems in our financial system. But I don't think it's my role as a historian to tell people what to do, but I try to foreground the arguments of Detroit activists. So I end my book talking about some of the demands made by the Frontline Detroit Coalition and some of the specific arguments they've made around the Green New Deal. But I think we need to look at what activists are already calling for and situate them in the context of this history. So, we can look at the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, some of the people at the Boggs Center. We can also look at local labor unions. I mean, some of the people in the Frontline Detroit March in 2019 were in SEIU and other local unions. So I don't see myself as the font of all the solutions here. I think that a lot of activists are pushing for all of this, but I think that historical research can help us see where some of these ideas came from. And also we can connect Detroit to broader conversations that are taking place in the US and around the world.
Yeah, great. I'm not seeing any other questions come up. Sarika, did you have any response to what you heard?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the question about, how to how do we sharpen our objectives, political objectives? That's really important. And then like what you think about this, Josiah. Like, I mean, I think that like putting these histories together and thinking about them together is a way to broaden the political horizon and to see how these struggles are interlinked, right? That it's right. I mean, is that the way
Yeah,
that,
and I don't want to send an overly diffuse message here, so I'll be really focused, right? Look, we need to decarbonize the economy by 2050, and we need to rebuild our infrastructure. And I think that my big argument about the New Deal, as I said before, was African Americans benefited less than whites because of housing and job discrimination, but they were also harmed more by the dismantling of all of this in the neoliberal period. So what does that mean? It means that the parts of the New Deal that I would argue are the most beneficial to working people and to poor people and to cities include things like public investment, the welfare state, labor rights. And I think we need those things when we talk about rebuilding infrastructure and decarbonization. So that means revival of public investment as well as social welfare policies and things like Medicare for all. So jobs guarantee, Medicare for all, public green investments. And we also need to look at race and gender inequities and the way they were built into the original New Deal and ask how we can avoid that. And as I said before, recognizing the legacy of housing discrimination and redlining, we need to think about prioritizing frontline communities for these investments. And also, making sure that, buildings, trades, jobs, for example, are open to people who historically have been excluded, i.e. people of color, and also, of course, investing in care work and other occupations that are predominantly made up by women. So so again, revival of public investment. I would also add a moratorium on water shutoffs, rights to healthcare and housing. Those kinds of demands, I think, should need to be integrated with anti-discrimination policies, investments in both care work and things like construction and building infrastructure, and public control over investment. So those would be my biggest arguments, and much of this is what is said by advocates of the Green New Deal. So I am certainly making a kind of defense of the Green New Deal in light of the history of the original New Deal and a very critical analysis of it.
That's very interesting. I was compelled by the kind of social reproduction arguments that you make in the book, and
which you mean, can you social reproduction meaning?
Right. It means the sort of like how we reproduce ourselves as a society. So capitalism has been the mechanism of reproduction of society, and that it actually, so the feminists have made the argument that it actually kind of makes the social reproduction of life very difficult, right? So in that sense, one of the things that, and maybe you can talk more about this, Josiah, a little bit, because it brings up sort of the gendered element in here about how water shutoffs were the mechanism to sort of take children away from homes, because sort of the Department of Social Services requires that you have functioning utilities. So like how that kind of debt, personal debt, and then the municipal debt of like the city and the kind of profit mechanisms, imperatives are sort of working to make the social reproduction much difficult, much more, right? Social care networks to be much more difficult. Yeah.
Right, which is why we need to look beyond the fence line, because in addition to places like 48217, most polluted zip code in the state of Michigan, there's this much bigger social reproduction crisis created by the evisceration of the welfare state, predatory lending, and other things I talked about. And so, yeah, just to understand the dimensions of environmental injustice in Detroit and really communities across the US and indeed around the world, we need to, have a gendered analysis. We need to look at what's happening in families. And this is made crystal clear if you look at Maureen Taylor, Marion Kramer, and the demands of the welfare rights activists. This is what they've been saying for decades. Nothing that I invented. It's crystal clear, the social reproduction crisis created here. And it also makes it clear that you can't have environmental justice if you don't ensure that all families have a right to water. Obviously, that's not really, I think, debatable. The question is, how do you do it, right? And so we have to talk about environmental justice beyond the fence line, because we're not just talking about where to, dirty facilities are put, but we're making sure that all households have the means to socially reproduce themselves. And that opens up questions about, the welfare state, healthcare, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I would like to, just for the sake of time, I would like to wrap this up and thank everybody for participating in this conversation. I thought that was a very illuminating talk. Josiah has a very good history overall. I think you got the major points and the major actors and the systems that are at play here in this discussion of environmental justice, racism, and debt. And so thanks so much. Thanks everybody for participating.
And thanks very much to Sarika for your great questions. Appreciate that.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks Sarika. Thanks for others for commenting. Camille, did you have any other final comments?
No, thank you all for coming. As Nick had said earlier, this is the last Green Street event of the year, of the month. So we're happy to have had you all join. I know that there's a few of you who have attended most of our meetings, and we really appreciate all of the support that you guys have given us. So thank you from all of us here. Thank you from the Office of Campus Sustainability and from Wayne State. So great, everybody.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Take care, and I hope to see you next time.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.